The year was 1888. History remembers it as the Great White Winter, a season when the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the wind did not merely blow. It howled like a starving wolf, shattering the illusion of human supremacy over the natural world. In the prosperous, bustling valley town of Blackridge, a place where men measured their worth by the weight of their gold and the complexity of their machines, a quiet apocalypse was unfolding. The grand mansions of the elite, built with imported stone and soaring windows, were transforming into opulent, freezing tombs. Inside the grand estate of Alderman Vance, a merchant who had spent his life hoarding wealth and squeezing the poor, panic had replaced arrogance. In his vast cellar sat a magnificent, imported cast-iron boiler, a marvel of modern engineering designed by Chief Architect Percival. It had cost $300, a sum that could buy a vast farm, complete with livestock. With its brass valves and gleaming pipes, it was supposed to be the ultimate triumph over nature. But there was a fatal flaw in their grand design, a flaw rooted in the hubris of men who refused to understand the laws of physics. You cannot negotiate with thermodynamics, and you cannot bribe the frost. Alderman Vance had vast stockpiles of timber, but it was green wood, freshly cut, and heavy with winter sap. The arrogant men of the city believed that a fire hot enough would simply burn anything. They were disastrously wrong. When forced into the $300 belly of the beast, the frozen moisture inside the green wood began to boil. Instead of releasing heat to warm the water in the pipes, the fire's energy was entirely consumed by the latent heat of vaporization, struggling merely to evaporate the water trapped within the cellular walls of the timber. The fire choked. It hissed like an angry serpent, producing suffocating clouds of bitter white smoke and a thick, toxic tar known as creosote, which rapidly clogged the expensive flues. The $300 machine was dead. The cold, relentless, and unforgiving crept through the Persian rugs and frosted the crystal chandeliers. In a fit of weeping despair, Alderman Vance, wrapped in layers of useless imported silk and fox fur, raised a heavy iron axe and swung it violently into his priceless, hand-carved mahogany dining table, shattering the heirloom to feed a dying fire in the parlor. They were surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet they were drowning in an ocean of ice. 2 miles away, at the very edge of the frozen tree line, where the wind whipped the snow into violent drifts, the pendulum of fate swung in the opposite direction. Here, sheltered beneath the snow-laden branches of ancient pines, sat a humble, dilapidated structure made of packed earth, river stones, and raw logs. The elite of Blackridge had mocked this place. They called it a hovel, a dirt hole unfit for animals. Yet, inside, the air was not merely warm. It was deeply, profoundly alive. It was a stable, radiant heat that embraced the skin like a thick woolen blanket. There were no $300 iron beasts here. There were no brass valves or crying merchants. There was only absolute, sacred silence, broken by the crisp, explosive crackle of perfectly cured, bone-dry timber burning in a simple stone hearth. The sound of dry wood catching fire is the sound of pure victory against the winter. 16-year-old Mora sat motionless by the fire, her hands resting softly on her knees. The golden light danced across her face, revealing not the hollow fear of the elite, but the quiet, immovable dignity of a guardian who has conquered the storm. A few feet away, tucked beneath a heavy quilt, her 5-year-old brother, Toby, slept deeply. His chest rose and fell in a slow, peaceful rhythm. His pale cheeks, once flushed with the threat of pneumonia, were now a healthy, warm pink. He was safe. Mora did not achieve this miracle with money. She achieved it with a deep, ancestral respect for the earth and a rusted iron grate that she had scavenged for exactly $9. Beneath the dirt floor of their modest cabin, a hidden low-tech lung was silently breathing. A carefully calculated trench, acting as a passive geothermal kiln, was working tirelessly in the dark. It utilized the Earth's constant temperature and the natural convective pull of the chimney to continuously drag cold, dry air through stacks of raw wood, pulling the moisture from the timber in a matter of weeks, a process that normally took an entire year. While the architects and aldermen of Blackridge froze in their mansions, a teenage girl with no formal education was commanding the invisible forces of thermodynamics, turning $9 of scrap metal and dirt into a fortress of life. But this piece was not inherited. It was not gifted. It was forged in the bitter fires of rejection and cruelty. The firelight reflecting in Mora's eyes held the memory of the day the illusion of her family was violently shattered. We must rewind the clock 4 months. It was late autumn, a time when the valley of Blackridge was painted in deceptive hues of gold and crimson. The air was turning crisp, carrying the first faint whisper of the brutality to come. On that day, Alderman Vance, the man who was supposed to protect his orphaned niece and her sickly little brother, looked at them not as blood, but as a financial liability in his leather-bound ledger. He had evicted them from the main house, tossing them into the forgotten, rotting boundary cabin, assuming the winter would quietly erase his problem. He assumed the mountain would break a 16-year-old girl. He did not know that when you strip everything away from a fierce heart, when a sister looks at the shivering frame of her little brother, all that remains is an unbreakable, ancestral will to survive. The earth remembers, my friends. It remembers the arrogance of those who build towers to the sky, and it cradles those who are humble enough to listen to its ancient, quiet heartbeat. Before we witness the precise, brilliant engineering that Mora used to build her dirt trench kiln, and before we see the exact moment the arrogant masters of Blackridge fell to their knees in the snow, begging her for a single splinter of dry wood, I invite you to join our circle around this fire. If you value the triumph of simple ancestral wisdom over modern arrogance, leave your mark. Subscribe to our fellowship. Share this testament of resilience with those who understand the value of a quiet mind, and press the like button to fuel this flame. Tell me, from what corner of the world, from which city do you listen to this tale of winter and justice? Leave it in the comments below, and let us journey together into the bitter frost of the past. To understand the magnitude of the miracle that would soon unfold, one must first feel the bitter sting of the gravel beneath Mora's worn leather boots on the day of her exile. It was late October, a season when the wind coming off the Blackridge peaks no longer carried the scent of pine, but the sharp, metallic taste of impending snow. Mora walked away from the towering iron gates of the Vance estate, her arms aching from the weight of her 5-year-old brother, Toby. The boy was wrapped in a frayed wool blanket, his small chest rattling with a wet, hollow cough that struck absolute terror into Mora's core. It was not a mere cold. It was the prologue to pneumonia, a death sentence for the poor in the shadow of the mountains. Behind her, the sprawling stone mansion of Alderman Vance stood like a fortress of absolute financial arrogance. Her uncle had decreed that feeding 2 orphaned mouths was an unnecessary drain on his capital. With the stroke of a fountain pen in his leather-bound ledger, he had severed their bloodline, tossing them into the forgotten, rotting boundary cabin at the farthest, darkest edge of his vast property line. The cabin was not a home. It was a decaying carcass of history. Built decades ago by forgotten pioneers, its log walls were warped, its roof sagged under the weight of wet autumn leaves, and brutal drafts whistled through the mud chinking. But the most unforgiving feature was the floor. It was not made of wood or stone. It was raw, packed dirt. Cold, damp, and unforgiving. As Mora set Toby down on a meager cot stuffed with dry grass, she touched his forehead. It was warm with the first whispers of fever. She looked around the freezing, damp shadows of the cabin. To survive, to keep the fragile flame of her brother's life from extinguishing, she needed heat. But not just a passing fire. She needed a constant, roaring, stable core of warmth. And for that, one needs dry, seasoned hardwood. But there was no seasoned wood left in the valley. Alderman Vance had monopolized the timber supply, hoarding the few dry logs for his own estate and selling freshly cut, green, sap-heavy pine to the desperate townsfolk at extortionate prices. Green wood is the enemy of survival. It is composed of nearly 50% water. When you try to burn it, it smokes, it hisses, it blinds you, and it yields no heat, as the fire exhausts all its energy merely trying to boil away the internal moisture. Normally, wood takes a full year of sitting in the sun and wind to cure. Mora had 4 weeks before the deep freeze would hit. She had no time. She had no power. What she did have, tied in a small rag hidden in her pocket, was her mother's entire life savings, exactly $9 in crumpled bills and heavy coins. It was then, staring at the freezing dirt floor, that the ancient, quiet voice of her late grandfather echoed in her memory. He had not been a man of grand universities or expensive iron machines. He was a man of the earth, a man who understood that nature, when respected, provides its own hidden engines. With quiet, desperate resolve, Mora took a rusted shovel and began to tear into the packed earth of her own living room. She dug a deep, precise trench stretching from the outer wall of the cabin directly to the base of the stone hearth. It was back-breaking, silent labor. Her hands blistered and bled, the crimson mixing with the cold, dark soil. When the trench was complete, she walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to the town's scrapyard. She handed over every single cent of her $9, her entire fortune, for a heavy, discarded, slatted iron grate, dragging it back through the mud to lay it perfectly over the long trench in her floor. It was on the 3rd day of her labor, as she was meticulously stacking wet, green wood directly over the iron grate, that the silence of the forest was broken by the arrogant snort of thoroughbred horses. A polished, lacquered carriage stopped outside the dilapidated cabin. The door opened, and out stepped Alderman Vance, draped in heavy Russian wolf fur, accompanied by Chief Architect Percival. Percival was a man of modern hubris, dressed in immaculate cashmere, smelling of expensive tobacco and profound superiority. He was the man who had convinced the entire elite of Blackridge to purchase his new $300 imported steam and iron boilers. They did not come to check on Toby's fever. They came to gloat, to inspect the misery of the banished, and to reassure themselves of their own supremacy. Vance pushed the rickety door open with a silver-tipped cane, his nose wrinkling at the smell of damp earth. But it was Architect Percival who burst into a cruel, echoing laughter when he saw Mora, covered in mud, kneeling beside a hole in the ground covered by scrap metal. "Good heavens, Vance!" Percival sneered, adjusting his silk cravat. "Has the girl lost her mind to the cold already? Are you digging your own graves, child? Because that is precisely what a ditch in the dirt is for." Mora did not stand. She remained kneeling, her hands resting on the damp, green logs. "It is a passive kiln, Mr. Percival," she said, her voice steady, betraying no fear. "I am going to draw the moisture out of this green wood before the snow falls." Percival's laughter ceased, replaced by a scowl of deep, intellectual offense. He looked at her as if a stray dog had attempted to speak Latin. A kiln? In a dirt trench? Percival stepped forward, his leather boots stepping dangerously close to her frozen fingers. Listen to me, you ignorant little peasant. Wood is dried by time or by the ferocious application of industrial heat. My new boilers, which cost $300 apiece, mind you, represent the absolute pinnacle of thermodynamic science. They feature brass pressure valves and cast-iron combustion chambers forged in London. He pointed his cane mockingly at her $9 scrap grate. And you think a rusted piece of rubbish over a hole in the damp earth will cure green pine? You are defying the basic laws of physics. The earth is wet. The earth is cold. By the very definition of thermodynamics, the damp soil will introduce moisture into your timber, accelerating fungal decay. You are not building a kiln, you foolish girl. You are building a rotting pit. Alderman Vance placed a heavy, gloved hand on Percival's shoulder, a sinister smile playing on his lips. Let her play in the mud, Percival. She has the stubbornness of her father. It will break soon enough. Vance looked down at Mora, his eyes completely devoid of familial warmth. When the frost truly bites, Mora, and that miserable pile of wet wood suffocates you in smoke, do not come crying to my gates. Although, he chuckled darkly, if you manage to scrape together a few coins begging in the streets, I might sell you some of my green timber. At a premium, of course. The laws of supply and demand are as unforgiving as the winter. The earth provides for those who do not demand to conquer it, Uncle, Mora whispered, her eyes locked onto the dark soil beneath the grate. Pathetic, Percival spat, turning on his heel. A $9 hole in the ground against a $300 engine of industry. You will freeze in this hovel, girl, and it will be your own arrogant ignorance that kills you. The heavy door slammed shut. The carriage rolled away, the sound of the horse's hooves fading into the chilling wind. Mora was left alone in the freezing shadows, listening to the agonizing sound of Toby's cough. She looked down at the $9 iron grate. She did not cry. She did not panic. She knew something that the men with their $300 machines and imported cashmere did not. They understood the violent force of fire, but they were entirely blind to the invisible, quiet magic of moving air. And within a matter of days, the relentless laws of nature were about to prove the elite of Blackridge catastrophically, mortally wrong. The arrogant architects of the modern age share a fatal misconception. They believe that for a machine to be powerful, it must be loud, it must be forged of expensive metal, and it must conquer the natural world by sheer, brute force. They look at a $300 cast-iron boiler with its shrieking pressure valves and heavy, brass-fitted doors, and they see the pinnacle of human achievement. They are deaf to the oldest truth of this planet. True power is not a conquering army. True power is silent. It is the invisible breath of the world, moving effortlessly through the dark, waiting only for those humble enough to guide it. Mora, a 16-year-old girl discarded by her own blood, did not have the luxury of arrogance. She had only a shivering 5-year-old brother, a dilapidated log cabin, and the quiet, ancestral wisdom of a grandfather who had once taught her how to listen to the soil. When architect Percival mocked her $9 iron grate, calling it a rotting pit, he exposed a profound ignorance of the very thermodynamic laws he claimed to master. He saw only a ditch in the dirt. Mora, however, had built a masterpiece of passive engineering, a geothermal, convective kiln driven by the eternal engines of the earth and the sky. Let us dissect the brilliance of this $9 miracle. To understand how a teenage girl outsmarted the wealthiest engineers in Blackridge, we must step inside the mechanics of her survival. The trench Mora dug was not a random hole. It was a highly calculated subterranean wind tunnel. It began outside the cabin, drawing in from a small, rock-lined opening on the side of the house, shielded from the violent, snow-laden northern winds. From there, the channel sloped downward, plunging beneath the frost line, tunneling beneath the packed earth floor of the cabin, and ending in a wide, shallow basin directly in front of her stone hearth. Over this basin, she laid the discarded $9 iron grate, its rusted slats acting as a perfectly ventilated floor. Directly upon this grate, she stacked her cursed treasure: wet, green, sap-heavy pine logs. The first principle of Mora's survival was geothermal tempering. The wealthy elite of the city looked at the winter earth and saw only a frozen wasteland. But Mora knew that the frost only penetrates the surface. Dig down a few feet, and the soil possesses massive thermal inertia. The deep earth acts as an ancient planetary battery, absorbing the heat of the summer sun and holding it throughout the bitterest winters. While the air outside was a bone-chilling 10 degrees, the soil walls of Mora's subterranean trench remained remarkably stable, radiating a constant, mild temperature of around 50 degrees. When the freezing, hostile winter air was drawn into the outside opening of her trench, it was forced to travel through this underground corridor. As it scraped against the stable, geothermal mass of the earth, the air was passively warmed. It required no coal, no brass valves, and no $300 combustion chambers. The earth provided this thermal exchange entirely for free. But warming the air was only the first half of the equation. The second principle was the magic of relative humidity, the invisible weapon that would cure her green wood. Cold winter air is incredibly dry. Its molecular structure is contracted, meaning it can hold almost no moisture. However, as that cold air moved through Mora's earthen trench and warmed up, its capacity to hold water expanded drastically. Its relative humidity plummeted. By the time that air reached the end of the trench, beneath the $9 grate, it had transformed. It was no longer a freezing winter breeze. It was an invisible, aggressively thirsty sponge, desperate to absorb any moisture it could find. Yet, for a kiln to work, this thirsty air must circulate. It must constantly move over the wet wood. Architect Percival's boilers relied on heavy mechanical drafts, forcing air through complex, easily clogged iron flues. Mora relied on the most reliable engine in existence, a vacuum. This brings us to the third principle, the chimney effect, a masterclass in passive convective airflow. Inside her cabin, Mora kept a small, highly conservative fire burning in the stone hearth. It was not a roaring blaze, just enough to sustain a gentle draft. As the hot exhaust gases from this small fire rose up and out of the chimney, they carried air out of the cabin. Nature, in its absolute pursuit of equilibrium, abhors a vacuum. The departing air created a zone of low pressure inside the small, sealed room. To equalize this pressure, the cabin aggressively sucked new air from the path of least resistance, the outside opening of the subterranean trench. And so, the invisible engine roared to life in complete, majestic silence. The small fire in the hearth pulled the freezing outside air into the trench. The geothermal mass of the earth warmed the air, dropping its relative humidity. This warm, hyper-dry air was then pulled forcefully upward, straight through the $9 iron grate, passing directly through the tight stacks of green, sap-heavy wood. Every second of every day, an endless, invisible river of thirsty air washed over the cellular structure of the timber. It pulled the water from the deep fibers of the pine, stealing the heavy winter sap, carrying the moisture up into the cabin, and venting it straight out the chimney. There was no stagnant dampness. There was no rotting pit, as the arrogant architect had predicted. There was only a relentless, perfectly calibrated system of continuous dehydration. In the open air, a freshly cut pine log takes a minimum of 12 to 18 months to dry properly. On Mora's $9 dirt trench, bathed in the continuous convective pull of geothermal air, the wood cured in 3 weeks. While Mora sat in the quiet glow of her cabin, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of little Toby, a very different scene was unfolding in the grand estates of Blackridge. The pendulum of winter was swinging, and it was merciless. In the mansions, the elite were fighting a losing war against basic physics. Architect Percival's $300 boilers were starving. The wealthy merchants, trusting their money over nature, were continuously shoving green, wet logs into the cast-iron bellies of their expensive machines. But an enclosed iron box has no passive airflow. It has no geothermal tempering. When the fire inside the boiler hit the wet wood, the 50% water content within the logs began to aggressively boil. The thermal energy of the fire, instead of radiating outward to warm the grand parlors, was entirely hijacked by the latent heat of vaporization. The fire was literally drowning in its own steam. The combustion temperatures plummeted. The wet wood smoldered, choking the heavy iron chambers with dense, suffocating, acidic white smoke. The moisture combined with unburned carbon to form thick, dripping layers of black creosote, which rapidly choked the expensive exhaust pipes. The $300 boilers were not heating the mansions. They were slowly, toxically suffocating them. The elite were trapped in a paradox of their own making. They had all the money in the world and mountains of timber, but without the ancestral knowledge of how to cure it, they might as well have been trying to burn wet sponges. Back in the humble log cabin, Mora reached out and picked up a piece of timber from the top of the iron grate. It was shockingly light. She tapped it against the stone hearth, and it did not produce a dull thud. It rang out with a sharp, resonant crack, like a piece of hollow glass. It was the sound of perfection. It was the sound of zero moisture. She placed the log onto the coals. It did not hiss. It did not smoke. It erupted instantly into a brilliant, towering, smokeless golden flame, radiating a fierce, clean heat that bathed the entire dirt floor cabin in absolute, impenetrable warmth. Toby shifted under his quilt, letting out a soft sigh, his skin glowing in the firelight. The $9 dirt trench had worked. The green wood had been transformed into premium, highly combustible fuel. Mora had conquered the physics of the cold, and she had done it just in time, because beyond the frosted windows of her tiny sanctuary, the sky was turning a sickening shade of bruised purple. The barometric pressure was plunging violently. The bomb cyclone of 1888, a storm of apocalyptic proportions, was gathering its breath, preparing to unleash a frozen hell upon the arrogant city of Blackridge. And when the snow began to fall, burying the imported boilers in a tomb of ice, the masters of the city would quickly realize that gold cannot buy warmth, and hubris cannot stop the frost. The history of the earth is written in cycles of brutal, uncompromising correction. Just when humanity builds a monument to its own vanity, nature exhales, and the monuments turn to dust, or, in the case of Blackridge in the winter of 1888, to ice. Meteorologists would later call it a bomb cyclone, a catastrophic, rapid drop in atmospheric pressure that pulled the pure, lethal vacuum of the Arctic down onto the valleys. But to the people of the town, it was simply the white hell. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky did not darken. It bruised, turning a sickly, suffocating shade of iron gray. The wind ceased its howling and dropped into a low, terrifying frequency, a bass hum that rattled the glass in the imported window panes of the grand estates. Then, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a matter of hours. The snow did not fall. It was fired horizontally across the valley, a blinding, abrasive sheet of crystalline fury that buried roads, suffocated livestock, and instantly severed Blackridge from the rest of the world. The trial had begun. The pendulum of winter swung violently toward the arrogant. Inside the sprawling stone walls of Alderman Vance's estate, panic had completely eclipsed reason. Chief Architect Percival, his expensive cashmere suit now stained with soot and panic, was on his knees before the $300 cast-iron boiler in the cellar. The cellar was freezing. The ambient air had dropped below 30 degrees, and their breath plumed in pale, terrified clouds. "More wood! Feed the combustion chamber!" Percival shrieked, his voice cracking as he desperately turned the brass valves that were now freezing tight. Alderman Vance's servants shoved massive logs of green, sap-heavy pine into the belly of the beast. But the laws of thermodynamics are entirely immune to desperation. The $300 machine was drowning in its own internal rain. As the heat of the dying coals hit the 50% moisture content of the green wood, the water boiled. The latent heat of vaporization stole every ounce of thermal energy. Instead of fire, the boiler vomited a thick, blinding, acidic cloud of white smoke. The heavy, black creosote, the toxic byproduct of burning wet wood, had coated the inside of the expensive iron flues. Suddenly, with a sickening metallic crack that echoed through the cellar, the rapid temperature fluctuation and the thick tar caused the main cast-iron exhaust pipe to fracture. The $300 mechanical lung of the mansion completely collapsed. Smoke poured into the cellar, driving the wealthy men upstairs, gasping and weeping as the sub-zero frost immediately claimed the lower levels of the house. The pendulum swung back into the silence of the earth. 2 miles away, at the edge of the roaring, wind-whipped forest, Mora's mud and log cabin stood immovable. Outside, the storm was tearing the branches from ancient oaks, screaming with a force that threatened to level the valley. But inside the cabin, there was no panic. There was no smoke. There was only profound, golden peace. Mora sat cross-legged on the floor, her hands resting softly on the dirt. The floor beneath her was not freezing. The earth, shielded by the walls and continuously gently warmed by the radiant heat of her hearth, acted as a massive thermal battery. It was a phenomenon known as thermal mass. The dense dirt absorbed the heat of her fire and slowly, steadily released it back into the room. She reached to the side and picked up a log that had spent the last 3 weeks resting on her $9 iron grate. Thanks to the continuous, passive convective pull of the underground trench, the freezing, dry air had stripped the wood of every drop of its sap. It was completely, perfectly cured. Mora placed the dry log onto the hot coals. There was no hiss. There was no struggle. The wood caught fire in less than 2 seconds, erupting into a brilliant, clean, smokeless orange flame. The temperature inside the tiny cabin held steady at a luxurious 72 degrees. On the cot in the corner, 5-year-old Toby slept the deep, restorative sleep of a child who feels absolutely safe. His breathing was clear, his chest rising and falling to the rhythmic, comforting crackle of the fire. The $9 ditch in the dirt had completely defeated the bomb cyclone. The pendulum swung back, crashing into the hubris of the elite. In the grand parlor of the Vance estate, the situation had devolved into madness. The central heating was dead. The temperature inside the mansion had dropped to 18 degrees. Frost was actively forming on the crystal chandeliers, and the water in the porcelain wash basins had frozen solid. Alderman Vance, wrapped in 3 layers of Russian wolf fur, was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard they chipped. "We need dry wood," Vance screamed at Percival, whose lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. "The green timber will not burn. The boiler is dead. We are going to freeze to death in this palace." Percival, his engineering arrogance entirely shattered, looked around the opulent room with wild, desperate eyes. His gaze landed on the grand dining room. "The furniture," he whispered, his voice hollow with horror. "The furniture is kiln-dried for carpentry. It has no moisture." It was the ultimate, humiliating defeat of the modern elite. The wealthiest men in Blackridge, the men who had mocked a 16-year-old girl for digging a hole in the dirt, were now forced to cannibalize their own vanity to survive. Vance lifted a heavy fireplace poker and brought it crashing down onto an antique, hand-carved mahogany dining chair. It shattered into splinters. They dragged the pieces of the priceless chair, imported from France at the cost of hundreds of dollars, and threw them into the parlor's open fireplace. It burned quickly. Too quickly. Furniture wood is dry, but it is thin and varnished. It provides a fast, aggressive flame that consumes itself in minutes, leaving no lasting coals. For the next 48 hours, the storm raged without mercy. And for 48 hours, the most powerful men in the city systematically destroyed their own wealth. They chopped up mahogany tables. They smashed oak writing desks. They burned the intricately carved legs of grand pianos. They were burning thousands of dollars of heirlooms just to keep their blood moving, surviving hour by agonizing hour in a smoky, freezing, devastated parlor. But a mansion is massive, and furniture is finite. By the morning of the third day, the storm broke, leaving behind a silent, waist-deep ocean of snow. The temperature was still a lethal 5 degrees below zero, and Alderman Vance's parlor was completely empty. There was nothing left to burn. The frost was creeping up their legs. Percival was huddled in the corner, no longer speaking, his hubris frozen in his throat. Vance looked out the frosted, ice-caked window. Across the valley, no smoke rose from the chimneys of the other wealthy estates. The entire elite class of Blackridge had suffered the exact same technological collapse. But then, Vance's desperate eyes caught something in the distance. At the very edge of the tree line, a thin, perfectly straight, clean ribbon of heat shimmer was rising into the freezing blue sky. It wasn't the thick, white, suffocating smoke of failing green wood. It was the invisible, steady thermal exhaust of a perfectly burning, hyper-efficient fire. It was coming from the boundary cabin. Vance fell to his knees, his breath catching in his throat. The memory of the girl, the mud, and the $9 iron grate crashed over him like a physical blow. The rotting pit was the only thing in the entire valley that had survived the storm. She had the only stockpile of perfectly dry, safely cured firewood within 50 miles. The men who had mocked her poverty were now dying in their wealth. And to survive the week, the arrogant masters of the city would have to drag their freezing bodies through the snow, march to the door of the 16-year-old girl they had banished, and beg for the very dirt-cured wood they had laughed at. The walk from the grand stone gates of the Vance estate to the rotting boundary cabin was only 2 miles, but for Alderman Vance and Chief Architect Percival, it was a march through the freezing graveyard of their own hubris. The morning sun was a cold, blinding white disk in the sky, offering no warmth as it reflected off the waist-deep drifts of the bomb cyclone. Every step they took in their imported frozen leather boots was an agonizing reminder of their failure. The men who had controlled the wealth of Blackridge were now reduced to dragging a heavy wooden sled through the snow, their chests heaving, their lungs burning with the sub-zero air. When they finally reached the edge of the tree line, they stopped, breathless and trembling. The sight before them defied everything their expensive universities and ledgers had taught them. The snow had buried the forest, but around Mora's humble, mud and log cabin, a miraculous perimeter of melted earth had formed. The thermal mass of the dirt floor, steadily warmed by the continuous, hyper-efficient fire inside, was radiating a gentle heat outward, creating a small sanctuary of life in the middle of a frozen wasteland. There was no smoke suffocating the clearing. There was only the sweet, clean scent of perfectly cured pine burning with absolute efficiency. Vance's hands shook uncontrollably as he approached the crude wooden door. This was the door he had banished his niece behind. This was the door Percival had mocked. Vance raised a frozen fist and knocked. The sound was weak, pathetic against the vast silence of the winter. A moment later, the door swung open. The contrast was staggering. A wave of stable, 72-degree air washed over the two freezing men, hitting them like a physical embrace. It was the deepest, most profound warmth they had felt in days. Standing in the doorway was 16-year-old Mora. She was not shivering. She was not covered in soot. Her face was calm, illuminated by the golden light of the hearth behind her. Percival's hollow eyes darted past her, landing immediately on the floor. There, resting perfectly over the subterranean trench, was the rusted $9 iron grate. And stacked upon it, bathed in the invisible, convective pull of the dry earth air, was a mountain of perfectly cured, bone-dry timber. It was a king's ransom. It was the only viable fuel left in the entire valley. Vance fell to his knees in the slush at the threshold. His lips were blue, his beard caked with ice. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a thick leather pouch, dropping it into the snow. It burst open, spilling shiny gold coins and hundreds of dollars in crisp banknotes. "Mora," Vance choked out, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "Please, the boilers are dead. We burned the dining hall. We burned the piano. The cold is in the walls. Name your price. Take the gold. Take whatever you want. Just give us the dry wood." Mora looked down at the glittering gold scattered in the mud. She did not smile. There was no vindictiveness in her eyes, no cruel satisfaction. She possessed the solemn, terrifying compassion of the natural world, a world that does not seek revenge, but simply demands equilibrium. "Gold does not burn, uncle," Mora said softly, her voice carrying the ancient weight of the earth. "And paper cannot cure pneumonia. You trusted your $300 machines, and they choked on their own breath. You mocked the dirt, but the dirt is the only thing keeping my brother alive." Vance wept, a quiet, desperate sound. "Then what? What do you want?" Mora pointed to the empty wooden sled they had dragged through the snow. "You will leave the gold. It is useless here. If you want the heat of this earth, you will trade in the currency of life. You will go back to your freezing cellar. You will load that sled with heavy wool blankets, jars of preserved fruit, salted meats, medicinal herbs, and sacks of milled flour. You will bring provisions that will ensure Toby does not feel a single day of hunger for the rest of this winter. You will trade the fuel of your survival for the fuel of his." It was a trade worth a fortune, paid for by a $9 piece of scrap metal and a hole in the ground. Vance nodded frantically, the tears freezing on his cheeks. "Yes, yes, anything. I swear it." And so, the greatest monopoly in the history of Blackridge was born not out of capitalist greed, but out of a sister's unbreakable vow to protect her blood. For the remainder of that brutal, historic winter, the wealthiest men in the city made the humiliating trek to the Boundary Cabin. They dragged sleds full of premium provisions, trading their most valuable survival goods for bundles of Mora's dirt-cured wood. The girl they had cast out became the quiet, undisputed guardian of the valley. She did not let them freeze. for the earth teaches us to provide for the vulnerable. But she ensured they never forgot the lesson. Every time they placed one of her perfectly dried logs into their fireplaces, watching it burst into clean, life-saving flame, they were forced to remember that a 16-year-old girl with a $9 rusted grate and a profound respect for thermodynamics had defeated their $300 imported hubris. Toby grew strong that winter, his cheeks flushed with health, his stomach full, safely wrapped in the very wool blankets that had once belonged to the elite. Mora's legacy was cemented forever. She did not build a towering monument of iron. She left behind a testament to the quiet, invisible power of the earth, proving definitively that nature will always outsmart arrogance. My friends, the fires of the modern world are built on illusion. We are taught to worship the expensive, the complex, and the loud. We are told that safety must be bought with gold, and that the earth is a thing to be conquered, paved over, and forgotten. But the Great White Winter of 1888 reminds us of the ancestral truth: true resilience costs nothing but humility. When the storms of this age finally arrive, when the complex machines fail and the power grid goes dark, it will not be the billionaires in their glass towers who hold the key to tomorrow. It will be the quiet ones, the guardians of the old ways, the ones who know how to listen to the soil, how to harness the wind, and how to protect those they love with the quiet dignity of a well-built fire. If this story ignited a spark within you, if you believe that the wisdom of our ancestors is the only true currency we have left, I ask you to stand with us. Subscribe to this channel and join our fellowship of guardians. Leave a like to keep this fire burning against the cold of the modern algorithm, and share this tale with someone who needs to remember the strength of the old ways. And before you go, tell me, from what city, from what corner of this beautiful, resilient earth? Are you listening to this message? Drop your location in the comments below and let us know that the legacy of the humble is alive and well in your home. Until the next storm, stay warm, stay wise, and never forget the power of the earth beneath your feet.